The deafening roar of failing engines filled Jack's ears as the ocean rushed up to meet him. In that terrifying moment, he had no idea that this crash would lead him to an ancient secret that would change the world forever. The roar of the engines filled Jack Thompson's ears as he gripped the controls of the Boeing 787, his eyes scanning the dark, turbulent skies ahead. Lightning flashed, illuminating the cockpit in brief, blinding bursts. The plane shuddered violently, causing Jack's stomach to lurch. "Mayday, mayday, mayday." He called into the radio, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "This is Ocean Air Flight 1721. We've lost both engines and are rapidly losing altitude. Our position is approximately 500 nautical miles southeast of Fiji. Request immediate assistance." Static crackled in response. Jack's co-pilot, Mike, looked at him with wide eyes. "Any response?" Jack shook his head, his jaw clenched tight. "Nothing. We're on our own." The altimeter spun downward at an alarming rate. Jack's mind raced, years of training kicking in as he ran through his options. The vast expanse of the Pacific stretched out below them, dark and unforgiving. "There!" Mike shouted, pointing to a small speck of land barely visible through the storm-tossed clouds. An island! Jack's heart leaped. It was their only chance. He banked the plane towards the tiny landmass, fighting against the howling winds. The aircraft groaned in protest, metal creaking ominously. "Brace for impact!" Jack yelled into the intercom, warning the passengers in the cabin behind. The island loomed larger, a strip of white beach, their only hope for survival. With a bone-jarring crash, the plane slammed into the sand. Jack's world exploded into chaos. The screech of tearing metal, shattering glass, and terrified screams. Then, darkness. When Jack regained consciousness, the first thing he noticed was the silence. Gone was the deafening roar of the storm and the dying engines. Instead, he heard the gentle lapping of waves and the rustle of palm fronds in the breeze. He blinked, his vision swimming into focus. Sunlight streamed through the shattered cockpit window. Jack turned his head, wincing at the pain that shot through his neck. Mike lay slumped in his seat, motionless. With trembling fingers, Jack reached out and pressed them against his co-pilot's neck. No pulse. A wave of nausea washed over him, and he swallowed hard against the bitter taste of bile. Unbuckling his harness, Jack stumbled out of the wrecked cockpit. The fuselage had split open, luggage and seats strewn across the beach. Bodies lay motionless in the sand. "Hello?" Jack called out, his voice hoarse. "Is anyone alive? Can anyone hear me?" Silence answered him. Jack moved among the wreckage, checking for survivors, but found none. 32 souls, gone in an instant. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like a physical force, threatening to crush him. As the shock began to wear off, Jack took stock of his situation. He was alive, albeit battered and bruised. The island appeared to be small and uninhabited, a crescent of white sand giving way to dense tropical forest. Crystal clear waters lapped at the shore, deceptively serene after the violence of the storm. Jack's survival training kicked in. First priority, fresh water. He stumbled towards the tree line, his legs unsteady beneath him. The humidity was oppressive, causing his uniform to stick to his skin. As he pushed through the undergrowth, a flash of movement caught his eye. Jack froze, his heart pounding. There, partially hidden behind a large fern, was a child. The girl, Jack guessed she was about 8 years old, stared at him with wide, wary eyes. Her skin was deeply tanned, her dark hair a wild tangle around her face. She wore what looked like crude clothing made from plant fibers. "Hello," Jack said softly, crouching down to appear less threatening. "I'm Jack. Are you okay? Are you lost?" The girl didn't respond. Instead, she backed away slowly, her movements fluid and silent. "Wait," Jack called out, but it was too late. The child vanished into the dense foliage, leaving Jack to wonder if he had imagined her entirely. Shaken by the encounter, Jack pressed on. He found a small freshwater stream and drank deeply, the cool liquid soothing his parched throat. As he splashed water on his face, the reality of his situation began to sink in. He was stranded on an unknown island with no means of communication. All of his passengers and crew were dead, and there was a wild child roaming the jungle. Jack made his way back to the beach, his mind reeling. He needed to gather supplies from the wreckage and create some kind of shelter. As he sorted through the scattered luggage, his thoughts kept returning to the girl. Who was she? How had she come to be on this island? And most importantly, were there others? As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Jack sat on the beach, staring out at the horizon. The beauty of the scene stood in stark contrast to the tragedy surrounding him. He thought of his life back in Seattle, his small apartment, his weekends spent hiking in the Cascades, the local bar where he'd unwind after long flights. It all seemed so distant now, like a half-remembered dream. Jack had always felt like an outsider, even in the bustle of city life. Orphaned at a young age, he'd been raised by his grandparents in rural Montana. The wide open spaces and big sky had called to him, leading him to pursue a career as a pilot. Now, surrounded by the vastness of the Pacific, Jack felt a strange sense of belonging. The island, for all its dangers, spoke to something primal within him. As darkness fell, Jack retreated to a makeshift shelter he'd constructed from plane debris and palm fronds. Sleep eluded him, his mind too full of questions and worries. The gentle sound of waves mingled with the unfamiliar calls of nocturnal creatures in the jungle. Just as he was drifting off, a noise snapped him to alertness. Soft footsteps approached his shelter. Jack's heart raced as he peered out into the moonlit beach. The wild girl stood there, her small form silhouetted against the star-filled sky. She watched him curiously, head tilted to one side. "Hello again," Jack said quietly, trying to keep his voice calm and friendly. "I won't hurt you. Are you hungry?" He slowly reached for his emergency rations, pulling out a granola bar. The girl's eyes followed his movements intently. Jack unwrapped the bar and broke off a piece, holding it out to her. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, with the silent grace of a wild animal, the girl darted forward. She snatched the food from Jack's hand and retreated several paces, watching him warily as she sniffed at the unfamiliar item. Jack's breath caught in his throat as the girl took a tentative bite. Her eyes widened in surprise, and she quickly devoured the rest of the granola. "Good, huh?" Jack smiled. "I have more if you want." The girl took a step closer, her gaze fixed on the remaining food in Jack's hand. As he offered her another piece, their eyes met. In that moment, Jack saw something that shook him to his core. Behind the wariness and wild nature, there was a spark of intelligence and curiosity. This wasn't just some feral child. This was a thinking, feeling human being who had adapted to survive in this harsh environment. As the girl accepted the second piece of granola, Jack made a silent vow. Whatever happened, he would protect this child and uncover the mystery of her existence on this island. The next few days fell into a routine of sorts. Jack salvaged what he could from the wreckage, creating a more permanent shelter and gathering supplies. He buried the bodies of his passengers and crew, the grim task weighing heavily on his conscience. The wild girl, whom Jack had started calling Zoe in his mind, appeared sporadically. She never came too close, but her visits became more frequent. Jack always made sure to have food ready for her, slowly gaining her trust. On the fourth day, as Jack was attempting to create a signal fire, he heard a commotion from the jungle. Zoe burst from the tree line, her eyes wide with fear. Close behind her came a large, snarling creature that Jack didn't recognize. Some kind of predatory mammal, its sleek body built for speed. Without thinking, Jack grabbed a piece of wreckage and charged towards the beast, yelling at the top of his lungs. The animal skidded to a halt, surprised by this new threat. It hesitated for a moment before slinking back into the jungle. Breathing heavily, Jack turned to Zoe. The girl stared at him, her chest heaving. For the first time, she didn't immediately run away. Instead, she reached out and touched Jack's arm lightly, her small hand cool against his skin. "You're welcome," Jack said softly, fighting back tears. It was the first real human contact he'd had since the crash, and it affected him more deeply than he'd expected. From that moment on, something changed between them. Zoe began to stay for longer periods, watching intently as Jack went about his survival tasks. She even started mimicking some of his actions, attempting to help in her own way. Jack found himself talking to her constantly, explaining what he was doing and why. He had no idea how much she understood, but the sound of his own voice helped keep him sane in the face of crushing isolation. As the days turned into weeks, Jack's hope of rescue began to fade. He maintained a signal fire and kept watch for passing ships or planes, but the vast expanse of the Pacific remained empty. Zoe became his sole companion, a silent presence that offered both comfort and new challenges. Jack found himself becoming fiercely protective of her, while also grappling with the ethical implications of potentially removing her from the only home she'd ever known. 1 month after the crash, Jack made a startling discovery. While exploring the island's interior with Zoe, they came upon the wreckage of an old sailing ship, half buried in the sand of a hidden cove. The wooden hull was rotted and covered in vines, but Jack could make out the faded name on the bow, Lady Margaret. As he examined the wreck, Zoe tugged at his sleeve. She pointed to a weathered piece of wood half buried in the sand. Jack brushed away the debris, revealing a crude carving, T. Blackwood, 1882. God save us. Jack's mind reeled. The implications were staggering. Had Zoe's ancestors been shipwrecked here over a century ago? How many generations had lived and died on this tiny island, hidden away from the world? As he turned to share his excitement with Zoe, Jack saw something in her eyes that gave him pause. There was a sadness there, a longing that he couldn't quite understand. For the first time, Jack truly grasped the enormity of the situation. Zoe wasn't just a wild child. She was the last of her kind, the sole survivor of a lost colony. And now, for better or worse, their fates were intertwined. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and pink, Jack sat on the beach, his mind still reeling from the day's discovery. Zoe crouched nearby, her dark eyes fixed on the sea, an unreadable expression on her face. "Your family," Jack said softly, more to himself than to the girl. "They've been here all this time, haven't they?" Zoe turned to look at him, her head tilted slightly. Though she didn't speak, Jack had begun to read her expressions, the subtle shifts in her posture that conveyed more than words ever could. There was a sadness in her eyes, a longing that spoke of loss and isolation. Jack's thoughts drifted to his own past, to the hollow ache of loneliness that had driven him to the skies. He'd always felt like an outsider, even in the bustle of Seattle. But here, on this remote island with this wild child, he felt a connection he'd never experienced before. As darkness fell, they made their way back to the makeshift camp Jack had constructed from plane debris and natural materials. The routine they'd fallen into over the past month felt both strange and comforting, a blend of modern survival techniques and Zoe's primitive knowledge of the island. That night, as Jack lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the jungle, he found himself at a crossroads. The discovery of the shipwreck had changed everything. He was no longer just a survivor waiting for rescue. He was now the custodian of a hidden history and the protector of its last living descendant. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. What right did he have to make decisions that would affect Zoe's future? And yet, could he in good conscience leave her here alone if rescue ever came? As the first light of dawn broke over the island, Jack made a decision. He would dedicate himself to understanding this place, to learning Zoe's way of life, and to finding a way to bridge the gap between their two worlds. The next few weeks saw a shift in their daily routine. Instead of focusing solely on survival and signaling for rescue, Jack allowed Zoe to take the lead. She began to show him the secrets of the island, hidden freshwater springs, caves filled with bioluminescent fungi, trees bearing fruit he'd never seen before. Jack watched in awe as Zoe moved through the jungle with fluid grace, her bare feet finding purchase on terrain that left him stumbling. She showed him how to set traps for small game, how to identify edible plants, and how to navigate using the stars. In return, Jack continued his attempts to teach Zoe English. Progress was slow, but he began to see glimmers of understanding in her eyes. She started to mimic his words, her pronunciation awkward, but improving day by day. One afternoon, As they sat in the shade of a large banyan tree, Jack pulled out a battered notebook he'd salvaged from the plane. He'd been using it to document his experiences and to sketch maps of the island. Zoe watched curiously as he began to draw. With careful strokes, Jack sketched Zoe's face, capturing the wild tangle of her hair and the intelligent gleam in her eyes. When he showed her the finished drawing, Zoe's reaction was one of wonder. She reached out, her fingers tracing the lines on the paper. "Zoe," Jack said, pointing to the drawing. The girl's brow furrowed in concentration. "Zoe," she repeated, the word coming out haltingly but clear. Jack's heart leaped. It was the first time she'd said her name, the name he'd given her. The significance of the moment wasn't lost on him. In that simple exchange, two worlds had collided and found common ground. As the days passed, Jack found himself thinking less and less about rescue. The island, which had once seemed like a prison, was becoming a home. He marveled at the intricate ecosystem, the delicate balance of life that had evolved in isolation. Zoe, too, seemed to be changing. Her initial wariness had given way to a burning curiosity about Jack and the world he came from. She examined his belongings with intense interest, particularly anything with writing on it. One evening, as they sat by the fire Jack had built, Zoe suddenly stood up. She motioned for Jack to follow her, an urgency in her movements that he hadn't seen before. Intrigued, Jack grabbed a makeshift torch and followed her into the jungle. They walked for what seemed like hours, pushing deeper into the island's interior than Jack had ever been. The terrain became steeper, the vegetation denser. Just as Jack was about to suggest they turn back, they emerged into a moonlit clearing. Jack's breath caught in his throat. Before them stood the ruins of what could only be described as a village. Crumbling stone structures, overgrown with vines and moss, formed a rough circle around a central plaza. At the far end, a larger building, perhaps a temple or meeting hall, loomed in the darkness. Zoe led him through the ruins, her steps sure and purposeful. She brought him to the large building, pushing aside a curtain of vines to reveal an entrance. Inside, Jack's torchlight illuminated walls covered in crude paintings and symbols. As he examined the markings more closely, Jack realized they were telling a story. The earliest images showed ships, not just the Lady Margaret, but others as well. There were depictions of people building homes, hunting, fishing. But as the narrative progressed, the images became darker. Disease, conflict, and dwindling numbers were clearly illustrated. The final image made Jack's blood run cold. It showed a lone figure, a child, standing amidst empty homes. With a jolt, he realized he was looking at Zoe's own history. Turning to the girl, Jack saw tears glistening in her eyes. For the first time, he truly understood the depth of her isolation, the weight of being the last of her people. Without thinking, Jack knelt down and pulled Zoe into a hug. She stiffened at first, unused to such contact, but then melted into the embrace. They stayed like that for a long moment, two lost souls finding comfort in each other. When they finally separated, Jack saw a new resolve in Zoe's eyes. She pointed to the paintings, then to herself, and finally to Jack. The message was clear. Her story wasn't over. A new chapter had begun with his arrival. As they made their way back to the beach camp in the pre-dawn light, Jack's mind was awhirl with the implications of what he'd seen. The island wasn't just a random spot of land in the vast Pacific. It was a repository of history, a hidden world with its own tragic tale. More than ever, Jack felt the weight of his responsibility. He wasn't just Zoe's protector now. He was the keeper of her people's memory. Whatever the future held, he knew he couldn't simply whisk her away from this place if rescue came. The island was a part of her, ingrained in her very being. As the sun rose over the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues, Jack made a silent vow. He would find a way to honor Zoe's heritage while also giving her the opportunity to know the wider world. It wouldn't be easy, but nothing worthwhile ever was. With newfound purpose, Jack began to plan. He would continue to signal for rescue, but he would also document everything he could about the island and its history. If, when they were found, he would make sure Zoe's story was told. As they shared a breakfast of fresh fruit, Jack watched Zoe with new eyes. She was no longer just a wild child. but a living link to a lost civilization. And somehow, against all odds, their paths had crossed in this remote corner of the world. The enormity of it all threatened to overwhelm him, but Jack pushed the feeling aside. They had work to do, a legacy to preserve, and a future to shape. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, the pilot and the last survivor, united by fate and bound by a growing bond that transcended language and culture. As Zoe smiled at him, her face alight with trust and curiosity, Jack felt a surge of hope. Their journey was far from over. In fact, he realized it had only just begun. The days that followed their discovery of the ruined village were filled with a new sense of purpose. Jack threw himself into the task of documenting everything he could about the island and its hidden history. He used his salvaged notebook to sketch detailed maps, cataloging the various plants and animals they encountered. Zoe, sensing the importance of his work, became an eager guide, leading him to places she'd never shown him before. One sweltering afternoon, as they explored a series of caves near the island's center, Jack made another startling discovery. Hidden behind a wall of vines, they found a small grotto. The walls were covered in more elaborate paintings than those in the village, depicting what appeared to be ritualistic scenes. But it was what lay at the center of the cave that took Jack's breath away. A stone altar stood there, and upon it rested a weathered leather-bound book. With trembling hands, Jack carefully opened the tome. The pages were brittle with age, but the handwriting was still legible. It was a journal dating back to 1882, the same year carved on the piece of driftwood they'd found near the shipwreck. "My God," Jack whispered, his voice echoing in the cavern. "This is it, Zoe. This is your people's story." Zoe watched him intently, her eyes wide with curiosity. Though she couldn't read the words, she seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. Over the next few days, Jack pored over the journal, piecing together the tragic history of the island's inhabitants. The author, Thomas Blackwood, had been a passenger on the ill-fated Lady Margaret. The ship had run aground during a storm, leaving the survivors stranded on the island. At first, they had maintained hope of rescue, but as months turned into years, they realized they were truly alone. The journal chronicled their struggles to survive, to build a community, and to maintain some semblance of the civilization they'd left behind. But it also revealed a darker side to their story. Conflicts arose between those who wished to maintain their old ways and those who embraced the island's primitive lifestyle. Diseases brought from the outside world decimated their numbers. And always, there was the crushing isolation, the knowledge that they were cut off from the rest of humanity. The final entries were the most heartbreaking. They spoke of dwindling numbers, of children born weaker with each generation. The last coherent entry, dated some 50 years after the shipwreck, spoke of only a handful of survivors remaining. Jack looked up from the journal, his eyes meeting Zoe's. How many generations had passed since then? How long had her family survived in isolation before she was left alone? The weight of this knowledge changed something in Jack. He had always felt a responsibility towards Zoe, but now it ran deeper. He wasn't just protecting a wild child. He was preserving the last link to a lost people. As the weeks passed, Jack's efforts to signal for rescue became almost perfunctory. He maintained the fire on the beach, but his heart was no longer in it. The island, which had once felt like a prison, now seemed like a sanctuary. Here, he and Zoe were the keepers of a secret history, guardians of a world untouched by the chaos of modern civilization. Zoe, too, seemed to sense the shift in their relationship. She became more open, more willing to learn. Her attempts at English grew more frequent, and though her vocabulary remained limited, her comprehension improved dramatically. One evening, as they sat by the fire watching the sun sink into the sea, Zoe suddenly spoke. "Jack," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Stay?" The question caught him off guard. It was the first time she had strung together a coherent thought in English. But more than that, it forced him to confront the question he'd been avoiding. Did he want to be rescued? The Jack Thompson, who aboard Flight 1721 would have said yes without hesitation. But that man felt like a stranger now. The island had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. "Yes, Zoe," he said finally. his voice thick with emotion. "I'll stay." The smile that lit up her face was like the dawn breaking. In that moment, Jack knew he had made the right decision, but fate, it seemed, had other plans. The next morning, as Jack and Zoe were gathering fruit in the jungle, a sound broke the usual chorus of bird calls and insect buzzes. It was distant at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder, more insistent. The thrumming of helicopter blades. Jack's heart leaped into his throat. After all this time, rescue had come, but instead of joy, he felt a surge of panic. He looked at Zoe, saw the fear and confusion in her eyes. "It's okay," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "We need to go to the beach. Remember the flying machine I told you about? That's what's coming." Zoe shook her head vehemently, backing away. "No," she said. "Stay." The sound was getting louder. They were running out of time. "Zoe, please," Jack pleaded. "We have to go. I promise I won't let anything happen to you." For a long moment, Zoe stood frozen, her eyes darting between Jack and the direction of the sound. Then, slowly, she nodded. They raced through the jungle, Jack's heart pounding in his chest. As they burst onto the beach, he saw the helicopter circling overhead. It was a Coast Guard rescue chopper, its orange and white paint gleaming in the sun. Jack waved his arms frantically, and the pilot must have spotted him because the helicopter began to descend. As it touched down on the sand, kicking up a cloud of debris, Jack felt a small hand slip into his. He looked down to see Zoe pressing close to him, her eyes wide with fear, but her jaw set with determination. The helicopter's door slid open, and a rescue worker in a bright orange jumpsuit stepped out. "Mr. Thompson?" He called over the roar of the engines. "Jack Thompson?" Jack nodded, suddenly unable to speak. The reality of the situation was crashing down on him. After months of isolation, of adapting to a new way of life, he was face to face with the world he'd left behind. The rescue worker approached, his eyes widening as he took in Jack's appearance and the small, wild-looking girl at his side. "Sir, are you all right? We've been searching for you for months. Your distress signal was picked up by a passing cargo ship." Jack found his voice at last. "I'm fine," he said. "We're both fine, but it's complicated." The rescue worker nodded, clearly confused but professional enough not to push. "We need to get you to a hospital, sir. Both of you. Can you board the helicopter?" Jack looked down at Zoe, saw the terror in her eyes. He knelt down to her level. "Zoe," he said gently, "we have to go now, but I promise you, I won't leave you. We'll face this together, okay?" Zoe stared at him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. Jack scooped her up in his arms and carried her to the helicopter. As they lifted off, he felt her arms tighten around his neck. Through the window, Jack watched the island recede, growing smaller until it was just a speck in the vast blue of the Pacific. His heart ached at the sight. It wasn't just an island they were leaving behind, but a world, a history, a way of life. As they flew towards an uncertain future, Jack made a silent vow. He would protect Zoe, would make sure her story and the story of her people was told. And somehow, someway, he would find a balance between the world they were entering and the one they had left behind. The helicopter banked, turning towards the horizon. Ahead lay civilization, with all its complexities and challenges. But in that moment, holding Zoe close, Jack felt ready to face whatever came next. They had survived the island. Together, they could survive anything. The journey back to civilization was a blur of noise, light, and confusion. The helicopter touched down on the deck of a naval ship, where Jack and Zoe were immediately surrounded by medical personnel. The cacophony of voices and the press of unfamiliar faces sent Zoe into a panic. She clung to Jack, burying her face in his chest and refusing to let go. "It's okay," Jack murmured, stroking her tangled hair. "I'm right here. No one's going to hurt you." A doctor approached, her manner calm and professional. "Mr. Thompson, we need to examine both of you. Can you tell me about the girl?" Jack hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Her name is Zoe," he said finally. "She was already on the island when I crashed. I think she's been there her whole life." The doctor's eyebrows shot up, but she maintained her composure. "I see. Well, we'll need to run some tests. Make sure you're both healthy. Can you convince her to let us examine her?" It took nearly an hour of gentle coaxing before Zoe would allow the medical team near her. Even then, she refused to let go of Jack's hand. The doctors worked around this, performing their examinations as best they could, while Jack translated their instructions into the simple English and gestures Zoe had come to understand. As the ship set course for the nearest major port, Jack found himself besieged by questions. Coast Guard officials, government agents, and journalists all wanted to know about his time on the island. But it was the arrival of Dr. Sarah Chun, an anthropologist specializing in isolated cultures, that truly changed the course of events. Dr. Chun listened intently as Jack recounted his experiences, her eyes growing wider with each revelation. When he showed her the journal he discovered in the cave, she could barely contain her excitement. "Mr. Thompson, do you realize what you found?" she asked, her voice trembling with awe. This could rewrite our understanding of Pacific Island cultures, a completely isolated community, evolving over generations. It's unprecedented. Jack nodded, feeling a mixture of pride and apprehension. "I know, but Dr. Chun, my main concern right now is Zoe. She's never known any world but the island. I'm worried about how she adapts." Dr. Chun's expression softened. "Of course, I understand. But Mr. Thompson, I think you're uniquely positioned to help her navigate this transition. You've bridged the gap between her world and ours. With your help, we could not only assist Zoe, but also preserve and study her culture." As they talked, a plan began to take shape. Dr. Chun proposed setting up a research station on the island, one that would allow for the study of its unique ecosystem and the preservation of the lost community's history. And crucially, it would provide a way for Zoe to maintain a connection to her homeland. "We'll need to move carefully," Dr. Chun cautioned. "The media frenzy around your rescue is already intense. Once they learn about Zoe and the island's history, it'll be overwhelming. We need to protect her and the island." Jack agreed wholeheartedly. He'd seen how Zoe reacted to the hustle and bustle of the ship. He couldn't imagine how she'd cope with the full onslaught of modern society. Over the next few days, as they approached the California coast, Jack worked tirelessly with Dr. Chun and a team of specialists to prepare Zoe for what was to come. They showed her pictures and videos of cities, cars, and crowds of people. Jack explained everything as best he could, but he could see the fear and confusion in Zoe's eyes. The night before they were due to make landfall, Jack found Zoe huddled in a corner of their cabin, tears streaming down her face. He sat down beside her, pulling her into a gentle embrace. "I know it's scary," he said softly. "Everything is changing so fast. But I promise you, Zoe, I'm not going anywhere. We'll face this together." Zoe looked up at him, her dark eyes shimmering with tears. "Promise?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I promise," Jack replied, his heart swelling with a fierce protectiveness. In that moment, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, his priority would always be Zoe's well-being. As the ship docked in San Francisco, Jack braced himself for the chaos he knew was coming. Despite Dr. Chun's best efforts to keep their arrival low-key, word had leaked to the press. The docks were swarming with reporters and curious onlookers. Jack held Zoe close as they disembarked, shielding her from the flashing cameras and shouted questions. Dr. Chun and her team formed a protective barrier around them, guiding them to a waiting car. As they drove through the city streets, Jack watched Zoe's reaction closely. Her eyes were wide, darting from one unfamiliar sight to another. The towering buildings, the rush of traffic, the sheer number of people, it was all overwhelming. "It's okay," Jack reassured her. "Remember the pictures we looked at? This is a city. We're safe here." Zoe nodded, but her grip on Jack's hand tightened. He could feel her trembling slightly, and his heart ached for her. How could he help her find her place in this alien world? Their destination was a private medical facility where Zoe could be examined more thoroughly away from prying eyes. As they pulled up to the building, Jack saw a familiar face waiting for them. "Grandma?" he gasped, hardly believing his eyes. Eleanor Thompson, a small, white-haired woman with a spine of steel, pushed past the security guards and medical personnel. "Jack, my boy," she cried, pulling him into a fierce hug. I thought I'd lost you. Jack returned the embrace, feeling a lump form in his throat. In all the chaos, he'd barely had time to think about his family, about the grief they must have endured thinking he was dead. As they separated, Eleanor's gaze fell on Zoe, who was half hidden behind Jack. "And who's this?" she asked gently. Jack placed a reassuring hand on Zoe's shoulder. "Grandma, this is Zoe. She saved my life on the island." "Zoe, this is my grandmother." Eleanor knelt down, bringing herself to Zoe's eye level. "Hello, Zoe," she said softly. "Thank you for taking care of my grandson." Zoe stared at Eleanor for a long moment, then slowly extended her hand in the greeting Jack had taught her. Eleanor took it gently, her eyes glistening with tears. As they made their way into the facility, Jack felt a glimmer of hope. If his grandmother could accept Zoe so readily, perhaps there was a chance for her to find a place in this new world after all. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of medical examinations, debriefings, and media management. Jack insisted on being present for all of Zoe's tests, helping to explain procedures and calm her fears. The doctors were amazed by her overall health, given her isolated upbringing, but concerned about her lack of immunity to common diseases. Dr. Chun worked tirelessly to keep the full story of the island and its lost community under wraps, allowing Jack and Zoe some measure of privacy as they adjusted to their new reality. But she also began making plans for the research expedition, excited by the prospect of studying the island's unique ecosystem and cultural history. Through it all, Jack found himself constantly torn between two worlds. Part of him longed for the simplicity of life on the island, for the deep connection he'd felt to nature and to Zoe. But he also rediscovered the joys of his old life: hot showers, varied foods, conversations with his grandmother. Zoe, for her part, tackled each new experience with a mixture of fear and fascination. She was particularly entranced by books, spending hours poring over pictures and trying to decipher words. Jack began teaching her to read and write, marveling at how quickly she picked up new concepts. But there were difficult moments too. Zoe would sometimes wake in the night, crying out in terror at the unfamiliar sounds of the city. She struggled with the concept of clothing, often trying to shed the garments they gave her, and large crowds still sent her into a panic, clinging to Jack like a lifeline. As the days passed, Jack realized that their journey was far from over. They had survived the island, but now they faced a different kind of challenge, finding a balance between the world Zoe had always known and the one they now inhabited. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset from the roof of the medical facility, Zoe turned to Jack with a serious expression. "Jack," she said, her English improving daily, "when go home?" The question caught him off guard. "Home?" he repeated. "You mean the island?" Zoe nodded emphatically. "Island home," she said. "Miss home." Jack felt a pang in his chest. He missed the island too, more than he cared to admit. But he also knew they couldn't simply go back to the way things were. "We'll go back, Zoe," he promised. "Not to stay, but to visit. Dr. Chun is going to set up a special place there to study the island. We can help her. Teach her about your home. How does that sound?" Zoe considered this for a moment, then smiled. "Good," she said. "Teach about home, but stay with Jack." Jack pulled her into a hug, feeling a surge of emotion. "That's right," he said. "We'll stay together, always." As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, Jack gazed out at the city sprawled before them. The future was uncertain, filled with challenges he could scarcely imagine. But with Zoe by his side, he felt ready to face whatever came next. Their incredible journey had only just begun. As the weeks turned into months, Jack and Zoe settled into a routine that straddled the line between their old life on the island and the demands of modern society. They lived in a small, quiet house on the outskirts of San Francisco, close enough to the city for Jack to work with Dr. Chun and her team, but far enough away to provide Zoe with the space and natural surroundings she craved. Jack's grandmother, Eleanor, had become an unexpected pillar of support. She moved in with them, her calm presence and unconditional acceptance helping Zoe adjust to her new life. Eleanor took to teaching Zoe about cooking, gardening, and other practical skills, bridging the gap between the primitive techniques Zoe knew and modern methods. One sunny afternoon, as Jack returned home from a meeting with Dr. Chen, he found Zoe and Eleanor in the backyard, tending to a small vegetable garden they had started. "Look, Jack," Zoe called out excitedly, holding up a ripe tomato. "We grow food, like Island." Jack smiled, his heart swelling with pride at how far Zoe had come. Her English was improving rapidly, and though she still struggled with complex concepts, her curiosity and intelligence shone through in everything she did. "That's great, Zoe," he said, kneeling down beside her. "You're becoming quite the gardener." Eleanor watched them with a knowing smile. "She has a natural gift," she said. "Reminds me of your grandfather, Jack. He could make anything grow." As they worked together in the garden, Jack filled them in on the progress of Dr. Chen's research expedition. Plans were moving forward to establish a small, sustainable research station on the island. The government, recognizing the unique nature of the discovery, had declared the island a protected site, limiting access to approved researchers only. "They want us to go back next month," Jack explained, watching Zoe's reaction carefully, "to help set up the station and guide the research team. What do you think, Zoe? Are you ready to visit home?" Zoe's eyes lit up, but there was a flicker of uncertainty there too. "Go home, but come back here?" she asked. "That's right," Jack assured her. "This is our home now, but we'll visit the island, help Dr. Chen understand its secrets. We'll be the bridge between both worlds." Zoe nodded, seemingly satisfied with this explanation. As they continued working in the garden, Jack marveled at how their roles had reversed. On the island, Zoe had been the teacher, showing him how to survive in her world. Now, he was guiding her through the complexities of modern life, but it wasn't always easy. Despite Zoe's progress, there were still moments of culture shock that caught them off guard. One evening, they decided to try dining out at a restaurant for the first time. Jack had spent days preparing Zoe for the experience, explaining the concept of menus, waiters, and table manners. But as they entered the crowded, noisy establishment, he felt Zoe tense beside him. "It's okay," he murmured, squeezing her hand reassuringly. "Remember what we practiced." Deep breaths. Zoe nodded, her jaw set with determination. They made it through ordering their meals without incident, Jack helping Zoe decipher the menu. But when the waiter brought their food, Zoe's eyes widened in dismay. "Where food come from?" she asked, her voice rising in distress. "Not see trees, not see animals. How no safe?" The other diners turned to stare, and Jack felt a moment of panic. He had explained the concept of restaurants, but he realized now that he had overlooked this crucial detail. On the island, they had gathered or hunted everything they ate. The idea of food appearing from an unseen kitchen was completely foreign to Zoe. "It's okay, Zoe," he said softly, aware of the curious looks they were receiving. "Remember how we talked about jobs? Some people's job is to make food for others. They know how to make it safe and delicious." Zoe frowned, clearly struggling with the concept, but not see them make. How trust? Jack paused, considering how to explain. Then an idea struck him. "Would you like to see where the food comes from? We can ask if they'll show us the kitchen." After a brief conversation with their waiter and the manager, they were given a tour of the restaurant's kitchen. Zoe watched in fascination as the chefs prepared meals, asking questions about every ingredient and process. By the time they returned to their table, her anxiety had been replaced by excitement. "Amazing!" she exclaimed. "So many ways to make food. Want to learn all?" Jack couldn't help but laugh, relieved that the potential crisis had turned into a learning experience. It was moments like these that reminded him of the unique perspective Zoe brought to the world, a perspective that forced him to question things he had always taken for granted. As they prepared for their return to the island, Jack found himself reflecting on how much had changed. The man who had boarded Flight 1721 all those months ago felt like a stranger now. He had been so focused on his career, on climbing the corporate ladder, that he had lost touch with what really mattered. The island and Zoe had taught him to see the world differently, to appreciate the simple things, the feel of sand between his toes, the taste of fresh fruit picked straight from the tree, the warmth of human connection unburdened by technology and social expectations. The night before they were due to leave, Jack found Zoe sitting on the back porch, gazing up at the stars. He joined her, noting how the constellations seemed dimmer here than they had on the island, obscured by the city's light pollution. "Excited about tomorrow?" he asked. Zoe nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Miss Island," she said softly, "but scared too. Island different now. We different." Jack put his arm around her shoulders, understanding exactly what she meant. "You're right," he said. "Things have changed. We've changed. But that's not a bad thing, Zoe. We've grown, learned new things. And now we can use what we've learned to help others understand the island, to protect it." Zoe leaned into him, silent for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jack, you my family now. You and Eleanor." Island was lonely. Here, not lonely. Jack felt a lump form in his throat, overwhelmed by the simple truth of her words. "That's right, Zoe," he managed to say. "We're family. No matter where we go or what happens, we'll always have each other." As they sat there under the stars, Jack felt a sense of peace settle over him. The journey ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges as they worked to bridge the gap between Zoe's world and modern society, as they fought to protect the island's secrets while sharing its wonders with the scientific community. But in that moment, none of that mattered. They had found each other against impossible odds, had created a family out of the wreckage of tragedy. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. The next morning dawned bright and clear. As they boarded the small plane that would take them back to the island, Jack felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He glanced at Zoe, saw the same emotions reflected in her eyes. "Ready?" he asked, squeezing her hand. Zoe took a deep breath, then nodded. "Ready," she replied, her voice strong and clear. As the plane took off, soaring over the city and out towards the vast expanse of the Pacific, Jack allowed himself a moment of reflection. Their incredible journey had taken them from the heights of modern civilization to the most primitive of existences and back again. They had survived, adapted, and grown. Now, as they returned to where it all began, Jack realized that this was not an ending, but a new beginning. They were no longer just survivors, but ambassadors between two worlds. And in that role, they had the power to make a real difference, to protect the island's legacy, to share its wisdom, and to remind the world of the deep connection between humanity and nature that so often gets lost in the rush of modern life. As the endless blue of the Pacific stretched out before them, Jack felt a surge of optimism. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he and Zoe would face them together. Their extraordinary adventure was far from over. In fact, he realized with a smile, it was only just beginning. The small plane touched down on the makeshift landing strip that had been cleared on the beach, the same stretch of sand where Jack had crash-landed months ago. As they stepped out onto the familiar terrain, Jack felt a rush of conflicting emotions: nostalgia, apprehension, and a strange sense of homecoming. Zoe stood still for a moment, her eyes closed and her face tilted towards the sun. When she opened them, Jack saw a mix of joy and uncertainty in her expression. "Smell like home?" she said softly, taking in the scent of salt air and tropical vegetation. Dr. Chun approached them, her face alight with excitement. "Welcome back," she greeted them warmly. "Are you ready to get started?" Over the next few days, Jack and Zoe worked closely with Dr. Chun's team, helping to set up the research station and guiding them through the island's terrain. Jack was impressed by the care and respect the scientists showed for the environment, their commitment to minimizing their impact on the delicate ecosystem. As they trekked through the jungle, Zoe seemed to come alive. She moved with a fluid grace that had been absent in the city, her knowledge of the island's flora and fauna proving invaluable to the researchers. Jack watched with pride as she confidently identified plants and their uses, demonstrating traps and foraging techniques that had been passed down through generations. One afternoon, as they were exploring a part of the island Jack hadn't seen before, Zoe suddenly stopped short. Her body tensed and she cocked her head to one side, listening intently. "What is it?" Jack asked, instantly alert. Zoe put a finger to her lips, then pointed to a dense thicket nearby. As the group watched in hushed anticipation, the undergrowth rustled, and a creature emerged that made the scientists gasp in amazement. It was a bird, about the size of a large chicken, with iridescent blue-green feathers and a long, curved beak. It regarded them warily for a moment before disappearing back into the foliage. "Incredible," Dr. Chun breathed. "That species was thought to be extinct for over a century. This is groundbreaking." Zoe nodded sagely. "Rare bird," she confirmed. "Sacred to my people. Never hunt. Protect always." As the excited scientists discussed the implications of this discovery, Jack felt a swell of emotion. This was why they were here. Not just to study the island, but to protect its secrets, to ensure that wonders like this rare bird would continue to thrive. That evening, as the research team gathered around a campfire to discuss the day's findings, Jack noticed Zoe slipping away into the darkness. He followed her, concerned, and found her standing at the edge of the beach, staring out at the moonlit ocean. "You okay?" he asked gently, coming to stand beside her. Zoe was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Island changing," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "People, machines, noise. Not same as before." Jack nodded, understanding her conflicted feelings. "Change isn't always easy," he said. "But remember why we're doing this. We're helping to protect the island, to make sure its story, your people's story, isn't forgotten." Zoe turned to look at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "But what if protect means destroy? What if too many people come, want to see rare bird, want to study plants? What if island become like city?" Her words hit Jack like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on the positive aspects of the research that he hadn't fully considered the potential negative impacts. Zoe, with her deep connection to the island, had seen what he had missed. "You're right," he said slowly. "We need to be careful. This isn't just about scientific discovery, it's about preservation. We need to find a balance." The next morning, Jack called a meeting with Dr. Chun and the lead researchers. He explained Zoe's concerns, emphasizing the need for stricter protocols to protect the island's ecosystem and respect its cultural significance. To his relief, Dr. Chun was receptive. "Mr. Thompson, Zoe, thank you for bringing this to our attention," she said earnestly. "You're absolutely right. Our primary goal should be conservation, not just study. We'll revise our plans immediately." Over the following weeks, a new approach took shape. The research team scaled back their presence, implementing a rotation system that would limit the number of people on the island at any given time. They established strict guidelines for interacting with the environment, with Zoe's traditional knowledge serving as a guide for sustainable practices. Jack and Zoe took on the role of mediators, bridging the gap between scientific inquiry and cultural respect. They worked with Dr. Chun to develop educational programs that would share the island's story with the world, while emphasizing the importance of preserving such unique ecosystems. As the initial expedition drew to a close, Jack felt a sense of accomplishment, but also a nagging uncertainty about the future. They would be returning to the mainland soon, back to their life in the city. How would Zoe cope with the transition this time? On their last night on the island, Jack found Zoe at the entrance to the cave where they had discovered the journal. She was running her hand over the ancient paintings, a wistful expression on her face. "Zoe," Jack said softly, "we don't have to leave if you don't want to. If you feel like this is where you belong, we can find a way to stay." Zoe turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Island always part of me," she said, "but not all of me now. Want to learn more, see more, want to help protect, not just this island, but all places like it." Jack felt a surge of pride at her words. In the months since they'd left the island, Zoe had grown and changed in ways he could never have imagined. She had taken the best of both worlds, the wisdom of her ancestors and the knowledge of modern society, and forged them into something unique and powerful. "Whatever you want to do," he said, "I'll be right there with you." Zoe smiled, reaching out to take his hand. "Know that?" she said simply. "We family." As they walked back to the camp together, Jack reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this point. What had started as a tragedy, a plane crash that had stripped away everything he thought. He knew had become the most profound experience of his life. He had found not just survival on this island, but a new purpose, a new family, and a new understanding of what truly mattered in life. And in Zoe, he had found a kindred spirit, someone who challenged him to see the world in new ways and to fight for what was truly important. The next morning, as they boarded the plane that would take them back to the mainland, Jack felt not the apprehension he had expected, but a sense of excitement about the future. He and Zoe were no longer just survivors of a crash, nor were they simply bridges between two worlds. They had become advocates for a new way of thinking, a perspective that valued the wisdom of the past while embracing the possibilities of the future. As the island receded into the distance, Zoe pressed her face against the window, watching until the last speck of land disappeared beneath the clouds. Then she turned to Jack, her expression determined. "We come back," she said. It wasn't a question. "Of course," Jack replied, "as often as we need to. But we have work to do out there too." Zoe nodded, settling back into her seat. "Tell Island's story," she said. "Teach people to listen to nature, to respect old ways." "That's right," Jack agreed. "And who knows, maybe we'll find other places that need protection, other stories that need to be told." As the plane soared over the vast expanse of the Pacific, Jack felt a sense of peace settle over him. The future was uncertain, full of challenges and possibilities he could scarcely imagine. But with Zoe by his side, he felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. Their extraordinary journey had transformed them both, had shown them the power of resilience, the importance of connection to nature, to culture, and to each other. And now, as they returned to the wider world, they carried with them not just the secrets of the island, but a mission to share its lessons with humanity. The island had given them a second chance at life. Now it was their turn to give something back, to become guardians not just of a single patch of land, but of the delicate balance between progress and preservation that would shape the future of the planet. As the mainland came into view, Jack squeezed Zoe's hand. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, the pilot and the last survivor, united by fate and bound by a love that transcended culture and time. Their incredible journey was far from over. In fact, he realized with a smile, the greatest adventure was only just beginning. As Jack and Zoe settled back into their life in San Francisco, they found themselves thrust into a new role, ambassadors for the island and its unique ecosystem. Dr. Chun had arranged a series of lectures and presentations at universities and environmental organizations, eager to share their groundbreaking discoveries with the scientific community. At first, Zoe was hesitant about speaking in public. The idea of standing in front of large groups of strangers was daunting to her. But with Jack's encouragement and Eleanor's patient coaching, she gradually gained confidence. Their first major presentation was at the University of California, Berkeley. As they stood backstage, waiting to be introduced, Jack could feel Zoe trembling beside him. "You can do this," he whispered, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "Just remember, you know more about the island than anyone. You're the expert here." Zoe nodded, taking a deep breath. "Tell Island's story," she said, as much to herself as to Jack. "Make them understand." As they walked out onto the stage, facing an auditorium packed with students, professors, and environmental activists, Jack felt a surge of pride. Zoe stood tall, her eyes bright with determination. Their presentation was a powerful blend of scientific data and personal narrative. Jack explained the unique biodiversity of the island, the delicate balance of its ecosystem, and the groundbreaking discoveries they had made. But it was Zoe who truly captured the audience's attention. With growing confidence, she spoke of her people's history, of the generations who had lived in harmony with the island. She demonstrated traditional techniques for sustainable living, explaining how her ancestors had maintained the delicate balance of the ecosystem for centuries. As Zoe described the rare bird they had encountered, now confirmed to be a species long thought extinct, a hush fell over the auditorium. Her words painted a vivid picture of the island's wonders, making the audience feel as if they were standing in the heart of the jungle themselves. When they finished speaking, the applause was thunderous. As they fielded questions from the audience, Jack was impressed by Zoe's poise and articulateness. She had come so far from the wild child he had first encountered on the island. In the weeks that followed, their story gained traction. Environmental groups reached out, eager to learn more about the island's sustainable practices. Conservation organizations offered support for protecting the island and its unique species. Jack and Zoe found themselves at the center of a growing movement, advocating for a more harmonious relationship between humanity and nature. But with increased attention came new challenges. One evening, as they were preparing dinner in their small house, Jack received a call from Dr. Chen. Her voice was tense as she explained the situation. "A private corporation has caught wind of our discoveries," she said. "They're pushing for rights to develop the island. They're talking about a luxury eco-resort, of all things. We're fighting it, but they have deep pockets and influential backers." Jack felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He looked at Zoe, who was watching him with concern, sensing the shift in his mood. "What can we do?" he asked Dr. Chen. "We need to make more noise," she replied. "Get public opinion on our side. The more people who understand the importance of preserving the island, the harder it will be for them to push this through." After hanging up, Jack explained the situation to Zoe. Her reaction surprised him. Instead of the fear or anger he expected, her expression was one of fierce determination. "We fight," she said simply. "Island is home, not for rich people's games. We make everyone understand." Over the next few months, Jack and Zoe threw themselves into their advocacy work with renewed vigor. They gave interviews, wrote articles, and continued their speaking engagements. Zoe's unique perspective and passionate delivery made her a powerful voice for conservation. They also worked closely with Dr. Chen and a team of lawyers to build a legal case for protecting the island. Jack spent long hours poring over environmental regulations and international laws, determined to find a way to safeguard the island's future. As their campaign gained momentum, they faced backlash from those who stood to profit from the island's development. There were attempts to discredit their story, accusations of exaggeration, and even fraud. Jack found himself constantly on guard, worried about how the pressure was affecting Zoe. But Zoe surprised him once again with her resilience. She seemed to draw strength from the challenge, her commitment to protecting her homeland only growing stronger in the face of opposition. One night, after a particularly grueling day of meetings and interviews, Jack found Zoe sitting on the roof of their house, gazing up at the stars. He joined her, noticing how the city lights obscured much of the night sky. "You okay?" he asked, settling down beside her. Zoe was quiet for a moment before responding. "Miss seeing all the stars," she said softly. "But understand now why fight is important. Not just for Island, but for all places where nature's still strong. For all people who live like my ancestors." Jack nodded, feeling a mix of sadness and pride. Zoe had lost so much. Her home, her isolation, the simplicity of her former life. But she had gained a global perspective, an understanding of the larger fight for environmental preservation. "I'm sorry you have to go through all this," he said. "If I hadn't crashed on the island..." Zoe cut him off, placing her hand on his arm. "No sorry," she said firmly. "Crash brought me to this world. Now we can help, can make difference. Is good thing, even when hard." Her words struck Jack deeply. He had been carrying a weight of guilt, feeling responsible for upending Zoe's life. But she was right. Their meeting, as unlikely and tragic as its circumstances had been, had opened up possibilities neither of them could have imagined. As they sat there under the hazy city sky, Jack felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were no longer just survivors of a crash, nor simply advocates for a single island. They had become symbols of a larger movement, voices for those who had no voice in the modern world. The fight to protect the island dragged on for months, a constant back and forth of legal battles, public relations campaigns, and tense negotiations. Jack and Zoe's life became a whirlwind of activity, barely leaving them time to catch their breath. But through it all, they found moments of peace and connection. Eleanor's steady presence kept them grounded, her quiet wisdom a balm for their frayed nerves. They made time for simple pleasures, tending their garden, cooking meals together, sharing stories under the stars. And always, There was the bond between them, a connection that had been forged in the crucible of survival and strengthened by their shared mission. Jack marveled at how far they had come, from strangers who couldn't even speak the same language to partners in every sense of the word. As the legal battle reached its climax, Jack and Zoe were called to testify before a congressional committee. The night before their appearance, neither of them could sleep. They sat together on the porch of their small house, the city quiet around them. Scared, Zoe admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack put his arm around her shoulders. "Me too," he said. "But remember why we're doing this. All those people we've talked to, all the support we've gained, it's made a difference. We've opened people's eyes to what's really important." Zoe nodded, leaning into him. "Tell Island's story one more time," she said. "Make them listen." The next day, as they stood before the committee, Jack felt a sense of calm settle over him. He looked at Zoe, saw the same determination in her eyes that had kept them alive on the island. Together, they told their story one last time. Jack spoke of the crash, of the incredible biodiversity they had discovered, of the delicate balance that had been maintained for generations. Zoe, her English now fluent and impassioned, described her people's way of life, the wisdom that had been passed down through the ages, the importance of preserving not just a place, but an entire way of thinking about humanity's relationship with nature. As they finished speaking, a hush fell over the room. Jack held his breath, waiting for the questions, the arguments, the political maneuvering to begin. But instead, the committee chair leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You've given us a lot to think about. Perhaps it's time we reconsidered our priorities as a society." In that moment, Jack felt a weight lift from his shoulders. They had done it. They had made people listen, had forced them to confront the consequences of unchecked development and the value of preserving the world's last untouched places. As they left the hearing room, surrounded by supporters and media, Jack pulled Zoe close. "We did it," he said, his voice choked with emotion. Zoe smiled up at him, her eyes shining. "No," she corrected gently. "We begin. Long fight still, for Island and for all places like it. But now people listen. Now we have chance." Jack nodded, realizing the truth of her words. This wasn't an ending, but a new beginning. They had found their calling, their way to make a difference in the world. As they stepped out into the sunlight, facing a crowd of cameras and microphones, Jack felt a sense of hope he hadn't experienced in a long time. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he and Zoe would face them together. Their extraordinary journey had led them to this moment, and they were ready for whatever came next. The island had given them a second chance at life. Now they would spend the rest of their lives giving back, not just to the island, but to the world. Their story, improbable as it was, had become a catalyst for change. And in that, Jack realized they had found the truest meaning of survival. The months following their congressional testimony were a whirlwind of activity. The committee's recommendation to protect the island and its surrounding waters as an international marine sanctuary had sparked a global conversation about conservation and sustainable development. Jack and Zoe found themselves at the center of this dialogue, their stories serving as a powerful catalyst for change. As they traveled the world, speaking at conferences and meeting with world leaders, Jack marveled at Zoe's transformation. The shy, wild child he had first encountered on the island had blossomed into a confident, articulate advocate for environmental protection. Her unique perspective, bridging ancient wisdom and modern science, resonated with people in a way that dry statistics and policy papers never could. One crisp autumn morning, as they prepared for a keynote address at a major environmental summit in New York, Jack found Zoe standing by the window of their hotel room, gazing out at the city skyline. "Thinking about the island?" he asked, joining her. Zoe nodded, a wistful smile on her face. "Always," she replied, "but thinking about this too." She gestured at the urban landscape before them. So many people, so much, everything. How find balance? Jack understood her question. It was something they grappled with constantly, how to preserve the natural world, while acknowledging the realities of modern society and human needs. "That's why our work is so important," he said. We're not just fighting to protect one island. We're trying to change the way people think about their relationship with nature." As they made their way to the conference center, Jack reflected on how far they had come. The island was now protected, its unique ecosystem and cultural heritage preserved for future generations. But that had been just the beginning. Their mission had expanded, encompassing a broader vision of global conservation and sustainable development. The conference hall was packed, filled with environmental experts, policymakers, and activists from around the world. As Jack and Zoe took the stage, a hush fell over the crowd. They had become well-known figures in the environmental movement, their story almost mythical in its impact. Zoe began their presentation, her voice clear and confident. "Island teaches many things," she said. "Teach us how to live with nature, not against it, but also teach us that no place truly isolated. What happened in one part of the world affect all others." Jack picked up the thread, outlining their proposal for a new global initiative. It wasn't just about creating more protected areas, but about fundamentally rethinking humanity's approach to development and resource use. "We need to learn from indigenous wisdom," he explained, while leveraging the best of modern technology and science. "It's not about going backwards, but about moving forward in a more balanced, sustainable way." Their speech was met with a standing ovation. As they fielded questions from the audience, Jack felt a surge of hope. People were listening, really listening. Change was possible. But amid the excitement and positive energy of the conference, a new challenge emerged. A group of indigenous rights activists approached them, expressing concerns about the unintended consequences of their work. "You've brought much-needed attention to environmental issues," one of the activists, a woman named Maria, explained. "But in some cases, it's led to indigenous communities being pushed off their lands in the name of conservation. How do you balance protecting nature with protecting people's rights?" The question hit Jack and Zoe hard. They had been so focused on their mission to protect the environment that they hadn't fully considered how their work might impact vulnerable communities. That night, back in their hotel room, they grappled with this new dilemma. Zoe paced back and forth, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Must protect nature," she said, "but not at cost of people. My ancestors live with island, not separate from it. How make others understand?" Jack nodded, feeling the weight of their responsibility. "We need to adjust our approach," he said. "Work more closely with indigenous communities. Make sure their voices are heard in conservation efforts." Over the next few months, they threw themselves into this new aspect of their work. They traveled to remote communities around the world, listening to local concerns and helping to develop conservation strategies that respected indigenous rights and traditional ways of life. It wasn't easy. They faced skepticism from both environmentalists who feared any compromise would weaken protection efforts, and from indigenous groups who had been burned by empty promises before. But slowly, painstakingly, they began to build bridges. In the Amazon rainforest, they worked with local tribes to develop sustainable forestry practices that protected the ecosystem while providing economic opportunities for the community. In the savannas of East Africa, they helped implement a co-management system for national parks, giving local Maasai people a say in conservation decisions. Through it all, Zoe's unique perspective proved invaluable. She could relate to the indigenous communities in a way Jack couldn't, understanding their deep connection to the land and their frustration with outsiders who claimed to know best. One evening, as they sat around a campfire with a group of San people in the Kalahari Desert, Jack watched in awe as Zoe conversed with the elders. Though they didn't share a common language, there was a deep understanding between them, a recognition of shared values and experiences. "She'd tell us of island," one of the elders said to Jack through a translator, "of living in balance with nature. We know this truth too. The world forgets." "You're Zoe," she reminded them. "This good work you do." Jack felt a lump form in his throat. "We're trying," he said. "There's so much to learn, so much to balance." The elder nodded sagely. "Balance is life," he replied. "Always changing, always moving. You and Zoe, you help world find new balance." Not easy work, but important. As they continued their journey, Jack and Zoe's relationship deepened and evolved. They were partners in every sense, in their work, in their mission, and in their personal lives. The bond forged on that remote island had grown into something profound and unshakable. Yet there were still moments of cultural disconnect, times when the vast difference in their backgrounds became apparent. Zoe sometimes struggled with the complexities of modern society, the unwritten rules and social norms that Jack took for granted. One night, after a particularly frustrating day of meetings with corporate executives who seemed more concerned with profit than planetary health, Zoe broke down. "Too much," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Too many words, too many lies. On island, things simple. Here, everything complicated." Jack held her close, feeling her frustration and exhaustion. "I know," he said softly. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity of the island too. But remember why we're doing this. We're fighting for something bigger than ourselves." Zoe nodded against his chest, taking deep breaths to calm herself. After a moment, she looked up at him, her eyes clear and determined. "You're right," she said. "Hard work, but important. We keep going." It was moments like these that reminded Jack of the incredible journey they had been on. From strangers thrown together by fate to partners united in a global mission, they had faced challenges that would have broken lesser spirits. But together, they had found strength, purpose, and a love that transcended cultural boundaries. As their work gained more recognition, they were invited to increasingly high-profile events. They dined with presidents and prime ministers, spoke at the United Nations, and were featured in major media outlets around the world. Through it all, they strived to stay true to their core mission. They used their platform to amplify the voices of indigenous communities, to challenge corporate practices that prioritize short-term profit over long-term sustainability, and to inspire ordinary people to make changes in their own lives. But the pressures of their public life began to take a toll. Jack noticed Zoe withdrawing more, seeking solitude whenever she could. He worried about the strain their work was putting on her, the constant demands of a world so different from the one she had known. One morning, he found her sitting in their small garden, her hands deep in the soil. She looked up as he approached, and he was struck by the peace in her expression. "I miss this," she said simply. "Miss feeling earth, growing things. In big meetings, big cities, easy to forget what really matters." Jack sat down beside her, understanding completely. "Maybe it's time we took a break," he suggested. "Go back to the island for a while, reconnect with what brought us here in the first place." Zoe's eyes lit up at the idea. "Yes," she said eagerly. "Need to remember, to feel island again. Then come back stronger, ready to fight more." As they made arrangements for their return to the island, Jack reflected on the cyclical nature of their journey. They had dawned from the island to the world, and now they were going back again, not to escape, but to recharge, to remember the source of their passion and purpose. Their work was far from over. The challenges facing the planet were immense, the forces of greed and short-sightedness often overwhelming. But as Jack looked at Zoe, saw the strength and determination in her eyes, he felt a renewed sense of hope. They had found each other against impossible odds, had built a bridge between two worlds. Together, they were showing that a different way was possible, a way that honored the wisdom of the past while embracing the possibilities of the future. As they boarded the small plane that would take them back to the island, Jack squeezed Zoe's hand. Whatever came next, they would face it together, the pilot and the last survivor, united in their mission to protect the Earth and inspire change. Their extraordinary journey continued, a testament to the power of love, resilience, and the enduring connection between humanity and nature. As the small plane approached the island, Jack felt a familiar tightening in his chest. The lush green expanse below, ringed by white sandy beaches and azure waters, was both achingly familiar and strangely new. Beside him, Zoe pressed her face to the window, her eyes wide with emotion. "Home," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the drone of the engines. They touched down on the same makeshift runway where their journey had begun years ago. As they stepped off the plane, the humid air enveloped them, rich with the scent of tropical flowers and the tang of salt. Dayar Chun was there to greet them, her face weathered by years of field work but still alight with enthusiasm. "Welcome back," she said warmly, embracing them both. "You won't believe the progress we've made." As they toured the research station, Jack was impressed by how seamlessly it blended into the natural environment. Solar panels peeked out from beneath camouflaged coverings, while the buildings themselves seemed to grow organically from the landscape, utilizing sustainable materials and design principles. But it was the forest itself that truly took his breath away. The biodiversity that had amazed him during his first stay on the island seemed to have exploded. New species of plants and animals had been discovered, each one a testament to the importance of their conservation efforts. "The ecosystem is thriving, Doctor," Chun explained as they walked along a newly established nature trail. By limiting human impact and implementing some of the traditional management techniques Zoe taught us, we've seen a remarkable recovery in several endangered species. Zoe moved through the forest with a fluid grace, her fingers trailing over leaves and bark as if reacquainting herself with old friends. She pointed out plants and their uses, her knowledge seamlessly blending with the scientific data Dr. Chun provided. As they reached a clearing, Zoe suddenly froze, her body tense. Jack was about to ask what was wrong when he saw it, the rare bird they had encountered on their first visit to the island. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its iridescent feathers shimmering in the dappled sunlight. "Incredible," Dr. Chun breathed, fumbling for her camera. "We've been tracking this species, but sightings are still extremely rare." But Jack wasn't looking at the bird. His eyes were fixed on Zoe. Tears streamed down her face as she watched the creature, her expression a mix of joy and profound sadness. In that moment, he realized the true depth of what she had sacrificed in leaving the island. That night, as they sat around a campfire with the research team, sharing stories and discussing future plans, Jack noticed Zoe growing quieter. Eventually, she slipped away into the darkness. He found her on the beach, staring out at the moonlit ocean. "You okay?" he asked softly, settling down beside her on the sand. Zoe was silent for a long moment before responding. "Feel torn," she said finally. "Love our work. Love helping people understand importance of nature. But being here," she gestured at the island around them, "makes me realize how much I miss this life." Jack nodded, understanding completely. "It's okay to feel that way," he said. "We've been so focused on the big picture. Sometimes it's easy to forget where we came from." Zoe leaned against him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not forget. Never forget. But sometimes wonder, made right choice? Leaving island, joining your world?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Jack thought carefully before responding. "I can't answer that for you," he said slowly. "But I do know that the work we've done, the changes we've helped bring about, none of that would have been possible if you'd stayed here. You've touched so many lives, Zoe. You've helped protect not just this island, but ecosystems around the world." Zoe nodded, considering his words. "True," she acknowledged. "The wonder sometimes, at what cost? To island? To me?" It was a question Jack had grappled with himself many times over the years. The fame they had acquired, the global stage they now occupied, it all came with a price. The simplicity of their life on the island seemed like a distant dream sometimes, lost in the whirlwind of conferences, meetings, and media appearances. "Maybe," he said carefully, "we need to find a better balance. We don't have to choose between this life and that one. We can find a way to honor both." As they sat there on the moonlit beach, a plan began to take shape. They would split their time between the island and the outside world, using the research station as a base for their global conservation efforts. They would bring small groups of influential people to the island, letting them experience firsthand the wonders of untouched nature and the wisdom of sustainable living. The next morning, they presented their idea to Dr. Chun and the research team. The response was overwhelmingly positive. "This could be revolutionary," Dr. Chun said excitedly. "A living laboratory where modern science and traditional knowledge intersect. We could train the next generation of conservationists here, show them what true sustainability looks like in practice." Over the next few weeks, Jack and Zoe threw themselves into developing their new initiative. They worked with the research team to design educational programs, reached out to their contacts in the environmental movement to gauge interest, and spent long hours discussing how to balance increased human presence with the need to protect the island's delicate ecosystem. But they also made time to reconnect with the island itself. Zoe taught Jack more of her people's traditions, showing him how to move through the forest in silence, how to read the subtle signs of changing seasons, how to live in true harmony with the natural world. One afternoon, as they were foraging for medicinal plants, Zoe suddenly took Jack's hand, leading him off the trail they had been following. They pushed through dense underbrush until they emerged in a small, hidden grotto. A waterfall cascaded down moss-covered rocks into a crystal-clear pool. "My special place," Zoe explained, her eyes shining. "Come here as child when need to think, to be alone. Want to share with you." As they swam in the cool water, laughing and splashing like children, Jack felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. This was what they were fighting for, not just the preservation of nature in some abstract sense, but the very real, visceral connection between humans and the natural world. Their time on the island passed all too quickly. Before they knew it, it was time to return to the mainland to resume their roles as global environmental advocates. But as they boarded the plane, Jack noticed a new lightness in Zoe's step, a renewed fire in her eyes. "Ready?" he asked, buckling his seatbelt. Zoe nodded, her smile radiant. "Ready," she confirmed. Remembering island, feeling connection, gives new strength. Now can fight harder, speak louder, make more people understand. As the plane took off, Jack watched the island recede into the distance. But unlike before, he didn't feel a sense of loss. Instead, he felt energized, rejuvenated. They were leaving, yes, but they would be back. The island was no longer a memory or a distant paradise, but an integral part of their ongoing mission. In the months that followed, their new initiative took shape. They began bringing small groups to the island: politicians, business leaders, educators, and artists. Each visitor left transformed, carrying with them a new understanding of the delicate balance between human needs and environmental preservation. Jack and Zoe's influence grew, their unique perspective reshaping global conversations about conservation and sustainable development. They testified before the UN, advised governments on environmental policy, and inspired grassroots movements around the world. But they always returned to the island, using it as a touchstone, a reminder of why their work was so vital. They brought their most challenging problems there, finding solutions in the interplay between scientific research and ancient wisdom. One evening, as they sat on the beach watching the sunset, Zoe turned to Jack with a thoughtful expression. "Thinking about day you crash here," she said. "How everything changed. For island, for me, for world." Jack nodded, remembering the terrified, desperate man he had been, fighting for survival in an alien environment. "I never could have imagined where that crash would lead us," he said softly. Zoe smiled, taking his hand. "Crash bad thing," she acknowledged. "But from bad, so much good come, like forest after fire. New growth, new life." As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Jack reflected on their incredible journey. From a tragedy had sprung a mission that was changing the world. They had faced countless challenges, had been tested in ways they could never have imagined. But through it all, their bond had only grown stronger. The island had given them a second chance at life. In return, they had dedicated themselves to giving the world a second chance, to forging a new path towards a sustainable future. It wasn't always easy, and the road ahead was still long and fraught with obstacles. But as Jack looked at Zoe, saw the determination and hope shining in her eyes, he knew that they were equal to the task. Together, they would continue to bridge worlds, to show that harmony between humanity and nature was not just possible, but essential. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the sky, Jack and Zoe sat in comfortable silence, listening to the rhythmic sound of waves lapping at the shore. Their extraordinary journey continued, a testament to the power of love, resilience, and the enduring connection between all living things. As the years passed, Jack and Zoe's work continued to evolve. always centered around the delicate balance between human progress and environmental preservation. Their island sanctuary became a beacon of hope, a living example of how humanity could coexist with nature in a sustainable, mutually beneficial relationship. One crisp autumn morning, as they prepared for a group of international students to arrive for a month-long immersive program, Jack found Zoe standing at the edge of the beach, her gaze fixed on the horizon. He joined her, noticing the thoughtful expression on her face. "Thinking about how far we've come?" he asked, slipping his hand into hers. Zoe nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Yes," she said softly, "but also thinking about future, about what comes next." Jack understood her meaning immediately. They weren't getting any younger, and though their passion for their work remained as strong as ever, they had begun to discuss the need for succession planning, for ensuring that their mission would continue beyond their own lifetimes. "We've planted the seeds," Jack mused, watching the waves roll in. "Now we need to make sure they grow." Over the next few weeks, as they guided the students through their program, Jack and Zoe found themselves paying special attention to those who showed particular promise. There was Maria, a fiery young activist from Brazil, with a deep understanding of the challenges facing the Amazon rainforest. Tom, a quiet but brilliant ecologist from Australia, whose innovative ideas for coral reef restoration had already gained international attention. And Amara, a charismatic leader from Kenya, who had mobilized her community to protect critical wildlife corridors. As they watched these young people engage with the island, absorbing its lessons and developing their own ideas for global conservation efforts, Jack and Zoe felt a renewed sense of hope for the future. One evening, as they all sat around the campfire sharing stories and dreams, Amara turned to Jack and Zoe with a serious expression. "How do you do it?" she asked. "How do you keep fighting when the challenges seem so overwhelming? When it feels like for every step forward, we take 2 steps back?" Jack and Zoe exchanged a glance, years of shared experiences passing between them in an instant. It was Zoe who answered, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "Remember why we fight," she said, gesturing to the lush forest around them, to the star-filled sky above. "Not just for trees, for animals, for balance, for future. Every small victory matters. Every mind we change, every heart we touch is step in right direction." Jack nodded, adding, "And we remember that we're not alone in this fight. Look around you. Each of you, and countless others like you around the world, are taking up this cause. The key is to never lose sight of what's possible, of the world we're trying to create." As the students listened intently, Jack and Zoe shared more of their experiences, the victories and the setbacks, the moments of despair and the triumphs that had kept them going. They spoke of the importance of finding balance, of taking time to reconnect with nature and with each other. In the days that followed, Jack and Zoe noticed a change in the group. There was a new energy, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. The students threw themselves into their projects with renewed vigor, their discussions becoming more nuanced, their proposed solutions more innovative. As the program drew to a close, Jack and Zoe knew they had witnessed something special. These young people were not just the future of the environmental movement, they were its present, ready and eager to take on the challenges facing the planet. On the final evening, as they gathered for a farewell dinner, Maria stood up, her eyes shining with emotion. "Jack, Zoe," she began, her voice wavering slightly, "we want you to know how much this experience has meant to us. You've shown us what's possible when we dare to dream big, when we refuse to accept the status quo. We promise you, we'll carry these lessons with us. We'll continue the work you've started." One by one, the other students stood, echoing Maria's sentiments. They spoke of the impact Jack and Zoe had had on their lives, of their commitment to carrying forward the mission of balancing human needs with environmental preservation. As Jack listened, he felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at Zoe, saw the tears glistening in her eyes, and knew she was feeling the same mix of pride, hope, and bittersweet emotion that was washing over him. Later that night, as they walked along the moonlit beach, Jack and Zoe reflected on what they had witnessed. "They ready?" Zoe said softly. "Ready to take up fight, to carry message forward. Jack nodded, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over him. "You're right," he agreed. "It's time to start stepping back, to let them take the lead." Over the next few years, Jack and Zoe gradually shifted their focus. Instead of being on the front lines of every battle, they became mentors, advisors, and elder statesmen of the environmental movement. They established a foundation to support young conservationists, providing funding, resources, and guidance to the next generation of environmental leaders. Their island sanctuary evolved as well, becoming a renowned center for environmental education and research. Students and scientists from around the world came to study its unique ecosystem, to learn from the delicate balance between human activity and nature that had been achieved there. As they entered their golden years, Jack and Zoe found a new rhythm to their lives. They still traveled occasionally, speaking at major environmental conferences and advising on global conservation efforts. But they spent more and more time on the island, tending to their garden, walking the forests they had helped protect, and welcoming a steady stream of visitors eager to learn from their experience. One warm spring morning, as they sat on the porch of their small house overlooking the ocean, Jack turned to Zoe with a smile. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" he asked. "If I hadn't crashed here all those years ago?" Zoe was quiet for a moment, her weathered face thoughtful. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but then think, maybe it was meant to be. You, me, island, all come together for a reason. To show world different way." Jack nodded, understanding completely. Their unlikely meeting, the fusion of their vastly different backgrounds and perspectives, had created something unique and powerful. They had shown that it was possible to bridge the gap between modern society and ancient wisdom, between human progress and environmental preservation. As they sat there, hand in hand, watching the sun rise over the ocean, Jack felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. Their journey had been long and often difficult, filled with challenges that had tested them to their limits. But it had also been incredibly rewarding, rich with moments of joy, discovery, and deep connection. They had found each other against impossible odds, had built a life and a mission that had touched countless lives around the world. And now, as they watched the next generation take up their cause with passion and determination, they knew that their work would continue long after they were gone. The island had given them a second chance at life, had shown them a new way of being in the world. In return, they had dedicated their lives to sharing its lessons, to fostering a global movement towards sustainability and harmony with nature. As the first rays of sunlight painted the sky in brilliant hues of pink and gold, Jack squeezed Zoe's hand gently. No words were needed between them. They had faced every challenge, celebrated every victory, weathered every storm together. Their bond, forged in the crucible of survival and strengthened by years of shared purpose, was unbreakable. The crash that had brought Jack to the island had seemed like the end of everything. Instead, it had been the beginning of an extraordinary journey, a journey of love, of discovery, of transformation. A journey that had not only changed their lives, but had helped to change the world. As they sat there, watching the new day dawn, Jack and Zoe knew that their story was far from over. The seeds they had planted would continue to grow, nurturing a new generation of environmental stewards. The bridge they had built between worlds would stand as a testament to what was possible when humanity reconnected with nature. When ancient wisdom and modern knowledge worked in harmony, their incredible adventure continued. Not in the form of daring escapades or global campaigns, but in the quiet, powerful legacy they had created, in the lives they had touched, the minds they had changed, the hope they had inspired, in the island that stood as a living example of sustainable coexistence, and in the global movement they had helped to foster. Jack Thompson, the pilot who had crashed on a deserted island, and Zoe, the last survivor of a lost tribe, had found in each other not just love and companionship, but a shared purpose that had transformed them both. Together, they had embarked on a journey that had taken them far beyond the shores of their island, touching lives across the globe and helping to chart a new course for humanity's relationship with the natural world. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the ocean in shimmering hues of blue and gold. Jack and Zoe sat in comfortable silence, grateful for the path that had brought them together, for the life they had built, and for the future they had helped to shape. Their extraordinary journey continued, a testament to the enduring power of love, resilience, and the profound connection between all living things. If you enjoyed this story, we'd love for you to support us by leaving a like and subscribing to our Slices of Life channel. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Which city are you talking about? It's very rewarding for us to provide our followers with an enjoyable moment. We appreciate the unconditional support you show us in every story. Blessings!